It will go away you won't remember it in 2 days. Yeah, the version of you that exists in 2 days' time doesn't have an issue with endnotes. You don't even notice it's on that face.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hi, I'm Hugh Heffernan,
I'm Laya Meabhdh.
and today we want to talk about our book, Out of Place. Out of Place is a documentary in 2 parts. We have a feature-length documentary, but alongside that, in parallel to that, we also created a photography book that kind of tells 2 parallel stories that are interlinked but also quite different.
Yeah.
And today we're going to talk about that. Before we even really get into the book, I think it's probably important that we say what Fail is, because we're all part of it, including Graham, who's behind the camera. But essentially, it's started in 2018 as a music festival just in Limerick City. And now we're working on films and we're working on books and all sorts of things within, I guess, the Irish music scene. This book came out of 2020 when we had funding for our festival, and then it all kind of went to shit. And we spent about a year recording and photographing. And I think during that process, like me and you kind of slowly started picking up a camera and started documenting everything through, film photography, through analog photography. And then, we got to this book, which is 2.5 years in the making. But I think before I want to talk through the book, I'd like to talk about what makes us into photography.
Yeah.
One of the first instances of photography that I really came across that really stood out to me was Wally Cassidy, a Irish photographer that covered countercultural movements in the 80s and 90s. And so this is his book, The Other Half Lives. And it's his photographs from the late 80s into the early 90s. And I just wanted to run through this just a little bit because this actually has probably, I imagine, the photos you might have seen first.
Yeah.
The trip to tip
Yeah.
photos.
I think these were our first experience with Irish photographers.
It really showed you just kind of this huge community coming to this small town and totally taking over. And it just shows you these small moments which kind of paint a bigger picture. You have this kind of culture, this kind of antagonistic culture that is at odds with an older Ireland. And that kind of carries over then into his more political work. What you see in a lot of his work, and what I see is this transition of a culture. People who are unsatisfied and people who are angry and people who are trying to provoke change. Seeing that was just a light bulb going off in my head. But another one actually similar to this, for me in particular, was Daido Moriyama. And this is one of his early books. This is Japan, a photo theater. This is Japan during the mid to late 60s. It shows transition from tradition to modernity and the kind of the pain that happens in that process. Seeing these photos, seeing these people in these places. Like with Wally's work, the tensions that kind of happen with these 2 opposing elements in a way that at some points these images almost feel like they're moving into total abstraction. When I saw this book for the first time, it just blew my mind.
I guess going off from what you said about this book for me, Nan Golan's Ballad of Sexual Dependency, when I saw this for the first time and you're kind of witnessing that kind of perfect imperfection and how things are shot as well, was extremely formative to me. So I guess one thing she talks about with this book and her work in general, that a lot of it is the people in her lives, the lovers she has or the friends that she keeps. being her family in that time and being her community, I suppose. You're not setting out to being like, I want to capture this, this is my goal. It's almost there or it's not there. And over time, that meaning can change.
Yeah, that's a beautiful book.
So that's that.
Absolutely. On to our book. It didn't really start off as it'll be this book or it'll be this story. It was just us collecting these images, which is something that we've done before. I think, we've both done a lot of gig photography.
Yeah.
So like with that, I think we took that mindset and created a book. We're like, we'll create a book with that approach to imagery. Then we kind of set out for about a year, making proof after proof after proof after proof. I think it took us a long time. I remember just emailing you, or actually we actually mostly talked over Instagram, going through pretty much from the get-go. I think this was this maybe a month or two after we finished?
That was very soon after we finished. And this was about a year then.
Yeah.
And every single time he was like, this is the final copy. No, this is the final copy. No, this is the final copy.
No, and I'd really, like every time we'd make one, I'd be like, oh, I love this. This is so perfect. 3 weeks later, I'd look at it again and I'd be like, there's something missing. There's something not quite there. Working on the film and working on the book, using electrical tape to create typography works really well on screen. Didn't really work in print. It doesn't really capture the texture of it. And when we thought we'd have a much smaller budget, we were trying to figure out how do we get neon green onto it. And then I think eventually we kind of knew that we'd have to just go all out. And that's kind of how we got to our final book. The first image I'd like to show from this book is the image of Podge.
Because this was the first shoot we did for the film as well.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I think we shot for, how long did we shoot for?
This was in August.
Was it in August?
This would have been,
Fuck.
yeah.
We started in August?
Yeah, because it was my birthday.
Oh,
of course.
It was
It was
my birthday
always.
weekend.
happy birthday, Graham.
Thanks.
And I remember it was after shooting the performance, and it was after all that I was like, okay, now it's time to do some still photography. Maybe I got 15 minutes with him just to shoot this image. At no point have I found really just a very formal portrait of Podge before. And I really wanted to capture that because his mask almost seems just like a war mask or something. So we have this spread here of some of your shots.
Yeah, and I feel like that's more us at the end of the day. One process we went to with making this book was like, the shots are there, but how do we make it feel like us? And bringing in more of those candid, off the cuff photos. It just felt a bit more real, I suppose.
I think importantly as well, during that period, we didn't really get to hang out in person outside of doing these shoots. So even though it was partly crew, it was also mostly kind of friends hanging out.
Yeah, it felt special just to be around each other, I suppose, in a sense.
Yeah. And as the edit of the film was coming along and the edit of the book was coming along, there was definitely a story coming out. And that's when I really started then going outside afterwards and documenting a bit of the city, because I felt it was just such an important character. And I remember this is a wall near where I live. And so I'd walk in by this most days, and someone had graffitied the side of someone's house. And instead of, sandblasting it or cleaning it off, they just kind of painted this really ugly brown square on their wall. And it was horror. It was so much worse than what was there before. But obviously the graffiti artist came back and then painted a flower over that. And I thought that was lovely. I thought it was just a dialogue that was happening over the course of a few weeks or a few months. And it was, I guess, this kind of dialogue of who owns this wall, who gets to express or to communicate on it. And that's when a lot of these other shots then started coming together. Just documenting the city and seeing a city that's changing in a way that isn't maybe necessarily relevant to us all the time. When you're seeing hoarding, you're seeing new offices or buildings, and then you're seeing these small moments, these small coded moments of graffiti or tags of just people trying to create dialogue or trying to make their mark in what is still their city, even though these things are happening beyond their control, they're taking control back. You know what I mean? And once we started pulling these images in and we started telling that wider story, that wasn't just about our experiences, but it was our experiences in relation to a city that's changing. And the work we're doing, the work that all the bands are doing, their story is still relevant to how Limerick is changing. And I guess this book, in a way, is just trying to highlight that and highlight the relevance and importance of the people who are covering. Like looking at these drawings, this should be a scrapbook of that period. Everybody's kind of going, okay, I need you and Graham to come over. But I just said, draw whatever, and we'll see what goes in. There was definitely points where you were looking kind of at me and kind of going, what should we be doing here? And I consciously did not tell you. You got some really good stuff. This is probably one of my favorite ones. This is one you did of Podge's Mask. Once we had these in, the book was done.
Yeah. I feel like it made it ours though, like going back, like in this like 2.5 year process, we kind of learned first and foremost how to make a book with like these earlier editions.
Yeah.
And it was fine, it was nice, but once we got to this kind of element of like bringing in that very like tactile, like us drawing on the paper, and it felt like us, but it felt more connected to the film. It felt more like well-rounded altogether. And that was, once that night was done, I think that was kind of like the moment where we're like...
I think so. I think it just transformed it. It made it into that scrapbook that I think we wanted it to be. And I do kind of feel like, this book is very much is kind of us in a way. I mean, it's us telling our story in the context of our city. The images in this book account for a little more than 1 second, cut over the span of 3 years. This is a pinhole view capturing a passing moment. The story is neither polished or neat. It is rough and taped together at the seams, fragmented and utterly incomplete.